They say that time softens everything, that the years will ease the sharp edges of pain and betrayal. But I never believed that about what happens inside a mother's heart. Not when the betrayal comes from your own son, the very person you raised and protected from the world. It was the afternoon he lit the match and dropped it carelessly onto the box of letters. Those delicate pages stained with ink and memory. The very same letters my husband wrote to me long before I became his widow, before the silence swallowed him whole. I stood there, watching the edges curl and blacken, the fragile paper crackle and surrender to flame, and I felt a deep hollowness settle inside me, like a cold shadow that would not lift. The flames swallowed not just the letters, but a piece of my history, a fragment of my soul that had kept me tethered to the man I loved and lost. In that moment, I understood something irreversible had happened. This was no ordinary fire. It was a deliberate erasure, a cruel act of forgetting imposed by someone who should have been my protector. I am 81 years old, living alone in a small apartment above a thrift shop in a part of town where the streets still remember the footsteps of those who came before me. I spend my days volunteering among forgotten things, objects tossed away but not quite lost, and perhaps, in some way, I am like them. Discarded memories wrapped in faded fabric, stories whispered in the quiet corners of my own life. Once I was a school secretary, the woman who knew every child's name and the secrets tucked in the folds of their backpacks. I was a wife who loved fiercely and a mother who gave everything she had to her son, raising him alone after my husband passed too soon, leaving behind only letters and photographs as reminders of a life that was. Those letters were my refuge, a sacred collection of moments captured in ink, the words of a man who loved me even when he was slipping away. I kept them close, hidden in a wooden box beneath my bed, a treasure trove of memories that no one else could touch or understand. But my son never understood. To him, those letters were nothing but clutter, relics of a past he wanted to bury, along with the man who was no longer there. He came one afternoon, the box in his hand, a dismissive smile on his face, as he told me it was time to let go. I tried to explain, to tell him what those letters meant, but his eyes were hard, closed off to anything that smelled of sentiment or weakness. Without a word of real understanding, he lit the match and watched the flames devour the fragile pages, the smoke curling upward like the silent screams I could not voice. I helped him gather the ashes afterward, as if by doing so I could somehow contain the loss, keep it from spreading beyond the walls of my home. I said nothing. I did not cry, did not yell. Instead, I folded my hands and let the silence speak for me. That moment marked the beginning of a new kind of loneliness, one that creeps in quietly, eroding the edges of your identity until you wonder if you ever really existed at all. My son began to visit more often after that day, but his presence was tinged with a strange mixture of pity and impatience. He spoke to me like I was a child, reminding me that I needed to move on, that holding on to the past was unhealthy, even dangerous. He suggested I sell my things, downsize, consider assisted living. The routines that had once given my days meaning, reading the letters, sorting photographs, tending to the little garden by the window, were now labeled eccentric and odd. Slowly, the world I had built inside my own walls began to shrink under his gaze, as if my memories were something to be controlled, diminished, and erased just like those burning pages. Yet, inside me, a quiet fire began to grow, one not fueled by anger or revenge, but by a stubborn refusal to be erased. One evening, I found a small fragment of a letter in the trash, a tiny piece of paper charred around the edges, but still bearing the familiar handwriting of my husband. It was the letter he wrote the night before he died, a message full of love and hope that had survived the flames meant to destroy it. I gathered that scrap carefully and took it to my writing desk. Over the next several days, I began to write again, pouring out the memories that had been stolen from me, handwriting every word with care and reverence. This act of creation was my first defiance, a way of reclaiming a history that my son sought to deny. I was rewriting not just letters, but my own story, one I would carry with me, regardless of who chose to see it or believe it. Not long after, my son arrived unannounced with a real estate agent, a stranger who spoke of properties and contracts as if my home was just another transaction to be handled. They brought brochures for assisted living communities, suggesting it was time for me to let go of my independence and move into a place where I could be taken care of. During a rare moment of confrontation, my son told me, "You're stuck in a fantasy, Mom. Dad's been gone longer than he was here. Grow up." His words cut through me like a sharp blade, but I held my silence. I knew then that whatever I said or did would not change how he saw me. So I stayed quiet, and inside, I began to prepare for an act that would be both an end and a beginning. One afternoon, when he was out of the house, I took a small tin from the back of my closet, the one where I kept photographs of my son as a baby. His tiny hands curled into fists, his first smile, his Halloween costume that I had lovingly sewn. I carried that tin outside and built a small fire in the backyard, carefully placing each photograph in the flames. As the pictures curled and blackened, I felt a strange calm wash over me. This was not a gesture of hatred or bitterness, but a way of reclaiming my memories on my own terms. If memory could be a weapon, then I chose what to keep and what to let go. The ashes scattered in the wind, and with them went the weight of a past I no longer needed to carry alone. Now I spend my days volunteering at the thrift shop beneath my apartment, surrounded by forgotten things waiting for new stories. I have made a friend, a young widow whose resilience reminds me of my own. I keep one photograph close, the one where my husband holds our baby son in his arms, both of them smiling with the innocence of a love unbroken by time. I do not burn the past anymore. I keep it like a quiet ember in my heart, a light that guides me forward without blinding me with pain. I have learned that love should not come with edits or conditions, and I refuse to be redacted from my own story. This is who I am now. A woman who has lived through loss, betrayal, and the slow unraveling of what she once knew. A woman who, despite the attempts to erase her, still stands, still remembers, and still chooses herself every single day. The day my son burned those letters was the day I realized how little I truly belonged to the life I had spent decades nurturing. It was a slow, steady unraveling disguised as a simple afternoon visit, one that began like any other, but ended with a quiet violence that no one else noticed. He came over that day with a box in his hand, one I had seen countless times before, a weathered cardboard container taped shut and hidden beneath a stack of old books on the top shelf of my closet. That box was sacred to me, a vessel of my past filled with letters from my late husband, carefully kept through the years like fragile relics that only I understood the value of. When he brought the box down and set it on the kitchen table, I felt a strange shiver ripple through me. a silent warning I was too afraid to acknowledge. He didn't ask permission or explain what he intended to do. Instead, with a casual, almost indifferent tone, he told me that it was time to get rid of those old things, that I should stop clinging to shadows and memories that only held me back. His words were sharp, but wrapped in a thin layer of concern, the kind that masks impatience and control. I tried to plead with him, to tell him that those letters were more than just paper, that they held the voice of a man I loved deeply, that they were my connection to a past that no one else could reclaim for me. But he cut me off with a tired sigh, eyes rolling in a way that made me feel small and foolish. "Mom, they're just letters," he said. "Sentimental clutter you don't need anymore." I remember the way he lit the match, fingers steady and unhesitating, and brought the flame to the corner of the box. The smell of burning paper filled the kitchen, sharp and acrid, mixing with the scent of old coffee and dust that always lingered in my home. I watched, frozen, as the fire spread, licking the fragile edges of the letters, curling the inked pages into blackened, crumbling fragments. I wanted to reach out, to stop him, to save what was left, but my hands lay motionless in my lap. Instead, I breathed in the smoke and felt a deep ache settle inside me, a grief so profound it seemed to hollow out my chest. I felt like a ghost watching my own history disappear before my eyes, powerless to intervene. After the fire died down and the ashes cooled, he pushed the remains toward me and said simply, "There. It's over now. Time to move on." His voice was flat, lacking the warmth I once knew, and his eyes avoided mine as if ashamed or unwilling to face the damage he had done. I took the ashes carefully, feeling the weight of loss heavier than any physical object could be. In the silence that followed, I gathered what little was left and hid it away, like a secret too painful to share. No one else knew. No one else would understand. And so the box, once a treasure chest of love letters, became a tomb of memories burned and buried by the one person I had trusted most. That afternoon marked a turning point, not just in the way my son treated me, but in how I began to see myself. The letters had been more than just words on paper. They were a lifeline to my husband, a tether to the woman I once was before grief and loneliness claimed me. When that tether was cut, I felt unmoored, drifting in a sea of silence where no one seemed to notice my absence. My son's act was not an isolated incident, but the first clear step in a pattern of erasure that would come to define our relationship. He started to visit more often, but his visits were fraught with subtle jabs and thinly veiled criticisms. He spoke to me as if I were fragile and confused, offering help I hadn't asked for and advice I didn't want. The tenderness I had once hoped for turned cold and distant, replaced by a patronizing tone that made me feel like a child being managed rather than a mother being respected. He began to talk about downsizing and simplifying, words that sounded like polite euphemisms for pushing me out of my own home and life. He suggested I consider moving to a smaller apartment or even an assisted living facility, places where I could be safe and looked after. When I resisted, he grew frustrated, telling me I was stuck in the past and needed to face reality. It was as if my grief was a problem to be fixed, a condition to be cured rather than a natural part of losing someone you loved. Every memory I held dear, every routine I clung to for comfort, was scrutinized and questioned. My late husband's name became a topic I was not supposed to bring up, a shadow to be avoided in conversation. The more he tried to control the narrative of my life, the more isolated I felt. My home, once filled with photographs and mementos of a shared life, began to feel like a museum curated by someone else. Things were rearranged without my consent, boxes labeled and stored away as if to hide my history. The tenderness I had once nurtured inside these walls was replaced by a sterile silence, punctuated only by the sound of my son's footsteps as he came and went, always with that look of mild impatience. It was a slow, invisible violence, the kind that seeps into your bones until you question your own sense of belonging. Yet, even as the world around me seemed to shrink, a small flame of defiance flickered inside. The night after the letters were burned, I found myself sitting alone in the dark, the ash still clinging to my fingers and the scent of smoke lingering in the air. I could still see the words my husband had written, his voice echoing in my mind with warmth and love. The memory of that night compelled me to take up a pen and paper, to write down what I still remembered from those letters before they vanished completely. Writing became my sanctuary, a quiet rebellion against the erasure my son sought to impose. With each word, I reclaimed a piece of myself, refusing to let the past be rewritten by anyone else. The fire in my backyard came weeks later, after my son brought over a real estate agent without warning, talking about next steps and future planning as if my life were a business to be sold off. It was then, in the solitude of my garden, that I burned the photographs of my son as a baby. Not out of spite, but as a symbolic gesture of reclaiming control over my memories. The flames rose steady and clean, and as the images turned to ash, I felt a strange peace settle over me. I was no longer willing to be a passive participant in a story that wasn't mine to tell. If memory was to be a weapon, then I would decide which parts to hold on to and which to release. That day, I made a silent promise to myself. I would not be erased, I would not be silenced, and I would not let anyone else dictate the terms of my existence. The letters may have been burned, and the photographs may have turned to ash, but the woman who lived inside those memories was still very much alive. I was no longer a victim of circumstance or family politics. I was a woman who chose to write her own ending, one where love was remembered on her terms and where her voice, quiet but unyielding, would not be ignored. After the day my son burned those letters, a slow shift began in the fabric of my life. A quiet unraveling that crept into the corners of my days like a shadow stretching longer as the sun sets. It was not marked by any grand gestures or explosive confrontations, but rather by a steady increase in subtle pressures and small cruelties that accumulated until the life I had known seemed to slip through my fingers like sand. My son's visits became more frequent, but instead of the warmth and care I once expected, they were filled with a brittle, impatient tone that left me feeling more like a burden than a beloved mother. Each time he arrived, there was a slight change in the way he looked at me, as if he were measuring my usefulness against some invisible standard, silently judging whether I was still worthy of his attention or simply taking up space that someone else could fill. He began to speak to me as if I were fragile or confused, a woman caught in the fog of her own fading memories. His words were always carefully chosen, polite, but edged with a condescension I could not ignore. "Mom, you don't need to worry about that anymore," he would say when I mentioned something from the past, as if my history were a childish tale better left forgotten. "You should focus on the present, on what's real." It was a phrase he repeated often, as though the weight of my grief could be lifted simply by forgetting. The routines that had once been my anchors, reading old letters, arranging photographs on the mantel, tending to the small plants by the window, were dismissed as eccentricities, signs of a mind clinging to shadows rather than living in the moment. His impatience grew with every passing week, a silent erosion of the respect and space I once commanded in my own home. With each visit, he would bring up the idea of downsizing, as if it were a gift rather than a threat. He spoke about how much simpler life would be in a smaller apartment, how safe I would be in a place where people could check on me regularly. He showed me brochures for assisted living facilities, their bright, sterile photographs promising comfort and care. But I saw in them the cold absence of freedom and dignity. When I resisted, he grew frustrated, telling me that I was holding on to the past and needed to accept that change was inevitable. "You're not the same woman you were 50 years ago," he said once, his voice low but firm. "And you can't live in a memory forever." It was as if the woman who had carried him, who had sacrificed and loved without measure, was no longer the woman he wanted to see. I felt myself becoming a problem to be solved rather than a mother to be cherished. The house itself seemed to reflect the growing distance between us. Things were rearranged without my consent. Photos carefully removed from the walls and placed in boxes labeled for storage or donation. The familiar spaces where I once felt safe now felt foreign and controlled, as if someone else had taken possession of my memories and was curating them to fit a narrative I was no longer part of. The little garden by the window, which had once bloomed with the careful tending of my hands, was neglected or replaced with plants I did not recognize. The rhythm of my days, once punctuated by small rituals of remembrance and care, was disrupted by interruptions and suggestions that I was out of step with the world around me. My son's visits, instead of offering comfort, became reminders of my diminishing place in the life I had built. The emotional weight of this slow erosion was heavy and exhausting. I found myself retreating further into silence, speaking less and less about the past that had been so violently taken from me. The loneliness that settled in was not the quiet solitude I had sometimes cherished, but a cold isolation, a feeling of being unseen and unheard, even in the presence of those who shared my blood. I noticed how I stopped inviting friends over, how I declined phone calls, and how the walls around me seemed to grow higher with each passing day. The grief that had once been a private wound now felt like a barrier between me and the world, and I was left wondering if I would ever find a way back to the woman I used to be. Yet, in the midst of this growing silence and loss, there was a small, stubborn ember of resilience that refused to be extinguished. I began to observe the subtle ways in which my son's words and actions sought to control not just my surroundings, but the very way I thought and felt. It was as if he wanted to rewrite my story, to replace my memories with a sanitized version that fit his comfort. But memory is not something that can be so easily rewritten. I clung to the fragments that remained, the smell of old paper, the feel of a photograph's worn edges, the echo of a voice long gone but never forgotten. These were my anchors in a sea of uncertainty. The first true act of resistance was quiet and almost unnoticed. One morning, after my son had left, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table staring at the empty space where the box of letters had once been. The silence around me was thick and heavy, but in that stillness, I made a decision. I would not let the past be erased. I would find a way to keep it alive, not just in paper and photographs, but in my own mind and heart. I took out a notebook and a pen and began to write, slowly at first, hesitantly, recalling the words from the letters I had lost. With each sentence, the woman inside me grew stronger, more certain. Writing became my refuge, my way of reclaiming what had been taken and holding on to the truth of my own story. As the weeks went by, I noticed a subtle shift in myself. The small acts of resistance grew into a quiet assertion of my autonomy. I rearranged a few things back to where they had been, refused to let my son's suggestions dictate my days, and began to nurture the garden again, despite the discouragement I received. I found solace in the memories I could still summon, the ones no fire could destroy. The pain of loss remained, but it was no longer the only thing that defined me. I was more than grief and rejection. I was a woman who had lived fully and loved deeply, and I was not done yet. The tension between us remained, thick and unspoken, but I no longer felt powerless. I had begun to reclaim my life in the quiet spaces between his visits, in the moments when I chose to remember and to hope. The road ahead was uncertain, and the battle for my dignity far from over. But for the first time in a long while, I felt the stirrings of something new, a life not dictated by loss, but shaped by my own will to endure and to heal. The first escalation had taken its toll, but it had also awakened a strength I did not know I possessed. I was ready to walk through the fire and come out the other side, not broken, but whole. The moment when everything began to change did not arrive with a grand revelation or a sudden confrontation, but in a quiet, almost imperceptible way that caught me unprepared, even as it stirred a small, fierce light within me. It was one of those ordinary afternoons, the kind that slip by unnoticed, except for the weight they carry in the silence that follows. I had been sitting at my small writing desk, the same one I used to keep my husband's letters, now scattered and lost. And I found myself holding a fragile scrap of paper I had rescued from the ashes, the last remaining piece of a letter my husband wrote the night before he passed away. The edges were charred and brittle, but the words, though faded, still whispered to me across the years. As I traced the familiar loops of his handwriting with trembling fingers, something inside me shifted. It was not grief or despair, but a quiet resolve, a determination to hold on to the fragments of my past, no matter what the world around me tried to erase. That day, I began to write, not letters, but memories. I wrote down everything I could remember from the pages that were gone, the way his handwriting slanted slightly to the right, the phrases he used to describe the morning light, the little jokes hidden between the lines. Writing became my act of resistance, a way to reclaim the story that had been nearly stolen from me. Each sentence was a small victory, each page a testament to the life we had shared and the love that still lived inside me. I wrote slowly and carefully, sometimes pausing to remember a detail or to catch the tear that blurred the ink. But with every word, the woman I thought had been lost began to return, stronger and more certain than before. This act of writing was more than just an attempt to preserve memories. It was a way to reconnect with myself, to rebuild the woman who had been diminished by years of loss and neglect. The simple act of putting pen to paper reminded me that I still had a voice, that my story mattered, and that I could still shape the narrative of my own life. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of agency returning, a quiet power growing in the space where silence had once reigned. I began to understand that the past, while painful, was not something to be feared or hidden, but a foundation upon which I could build something new. Around this time, the visits from my son continued, but something inside me had changed. I no longer received his words with the same helplessness or submission. When he spoke of moving on or letting go, I listened but did not let his impatience dictate my feelings. I started to set boundaries, gently but firmly, making it clear that my grief was mine to carry and that no one had the right to rewrite my history. This newfound strength was not born of anger, but of quiet clarity. I was no longer willing to be diminished or dismissed. The woman who had been crushed under the weight of loss was awakening, and with her came a calm but unyielding determination to reclaim her place in the world. The garden by my window, once neglected under his watchful eye, began to bloom again. I took to watering the plants and nurturing the flowers, small acts of care that felt like a declaration of life amid the shadows. The scent of the earth, the feel of soil between my fingers, grounded me in a way words could not. It was as if tending to the garden was tending to my own spirit, nurturing the fragile shoots of hope that had begun to grow. The routine gave me strength and a renewed sense of purpose, a way to reconnect with the rhythms of a world that had not entirely forgotten me. As the weeks passed, I also found solace in the small community around me. I reconnected with a few old friends and made tentative new ones, people who saw me not as a burden, but as a person with a story worth hearing. Their presence was a balm to my aching soul, a reminder that I was not alone, even when I felt most invisible. I began volunteering at a local thrift shop, a place filled with discarded treasures and forgotten histories. Among the second-hand books and worn furniture, I found a metaphor for my own life, something once loved and lost, but still capable of being cherished again. The work gave me a sense of belonging and usefulness that had long been absent. It was a step toward rebuilding not just a life, but a self. This slow rebuilding was not without its challenges. The tension with my son remained, a quiet but persistent undercurrent in my days. He still brought up the idea of assisted living and downsizing, and the conversations about the future were often strained and uncomfortable. Yet, even in those moments, I felt less afraid and more prepared. The act of writing, the tending of my garden, the connections I nurtured, these became the foundation of my resistance. I was no longer waiting for permission or validation. I was taking back the narrative, piece by piece, word by word. One evening, as I sat by the window watching the last light fade from the sky, I realized that this quiet shift was the beginning of a new chapter. I was not the same woman who had sat helplessly as her past went up in flames. I was someone who had faced the fire and chosen not to be consumed by it. The ashes of my memories had not destroyed me. They had cleared the ground for something new to grow, and though the road ahead was uncertain, I was ready to walk it with my own feet, carrying the past not as a burden, but as a part of my strength. The slow, steady rebuilding of my life, fragile and tentative as it was, came under sharp challenge when the past crept back into my world in a way I could neither ignore nor avoid. After weeks of quiet defiance, of writing memories by hand and reclaiming small pieces of myself, I found the fragile peace I had begun to build, threatened by the arrival of people and pressures I had long feared but had hoped to keep at bay. It started subtly, with a letter that arrived one gray morning slipped under my apartment door, its envelope thick and unfamiliar, bearing no return address. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, unmistakably my son's. Inside was a note asking me to meet, to talk about the future, and beneath it, a brochure for an assisted living facility that promised safety, community, and care. The words burned like a cold wind across my skin, a reminder that the past was not done with me yet. That same week, without warning, my son showed up at my door, not alone, but with a woman I had never met, someone who introduced herself as a real estate agent. Her smile was polite but clinical, as if she were appraising not just my apartment, but the woman who lived there. The air between us was thick with unspoken accusations and resentments that neither my son nor I dared to voice aloud. The agent spoke of selling the apartment, of finding a smaller, more manageable place for me, one better suited to my needs as an aging widow. The words felt like a siege, closing in around me, eroding the fragile walls of independence I had built so carefully. My son watched, his eyes sharp and calculating, as if trying to gauge my reaction, searching for the moment I might crumble. During their visit, I said little, but inside, a storm raged. I was tired. Tired of feeling like a child being managed rather than a woman being respected. Tired of the constant pressure to conform to an image that did not fit me. When my son said, "Mom, you're stuck in a fantasy. Dad's been gone longer than he was here. It's time to grow up." His voice was low but heavy with judgment, and his words landed like stones on my chest. I wanted to respond with everything I felt. The years of loss, the loneliness, the small triumphs of reclaiming my memories, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I held my silence as a shield, knowing that this fight was not one that could be won in anger or tears. The days that followed were some of the hardest I had faced. I felt the walls closing in, the relentless pressure to give up my home, my memories, and my autonomy weighing on me like a lead blanket. The real estate agent called several times, always with the same polite but insistent tone, asking if I had given any thought to the options. Each call felt like a violation, a reminder that my life was being parceled out and negotiated without my consent. My son's messages were terse and practical, full of reminders about appointments and plans I was not part of making. It was as if I were being erased not just from my home, but from the very narrative of my existence. In the midst of this, a moment of unexpected tenderness arrived in the form of a letter from my grandson, Kieran. Unlike the others, his words were free of judgment or demands. He wrote simply that he missed me and wanted to see me, that he was worried but hoped I was safe. His letter was a small lifeline, a thread connecting me to a part of my family that had not yet been lost. I kept the letter close, reading it over and over when the weight of the adult world pressed too heavily on my shoulders. Kieran's voice reminded me that not all ties were broken, that some bridges could still be crossed if I was willing. But the tension with my son only grew. One afternoon he arrived unannounced with a man in a sharp suit who introduced himself as a lawyer representing him and my daughter-in-law. The man spoke carefully, his words wrapped in legal jargon and veiled concern, explaining that they wanted to ensure I was in a safe environment and discussing next steps that might be necessary. I felt a cold rage rise within me, not at the man, but at the fact that my family had chosen to speak through lawyers rather than with me. I told the lawyer firmly that I was of sound mind and living in a safe environment, and that any further attempts to control my life without my consent would be considered harassment. The man nodded, a flicker of surprise crossing his face, and left. But the message was clear. My son and daughter-in-law were determined to take control, no matter what I wanted. That night, I sat alone in my apartment. The silence heavier than ever. I pulled out the small tin where I had kept the photographs of my son as a baby. The images of his first smile, his tiny hands, the moments of innocence and hope that once filled our lives. I built a small fire in the backyard, carefully placing each photograph into the flames. The fire was steady and clean, the smoke rising into the cool night air. It was not an act of vengeance, but a symbolic reclaiming of my memories, a way of saying that if my past was to be controlled by others, then I would choose what to hold and what to release. As the photographs curled and blackened, I felt a strange peace settle over me, a release from the weight of expectations and control. In the days that followed, my son's visits became less frequent, but the shadow of conflict remained. I found solace in the small acts of daily life, the routines I insisted on maintaining despite the pressure to give them up, the friendships I nurtured outside my family's gaze, the writing that continued to be my refuge. I realized that while the battle for my autonomy was far from over, I had taken a crucial step by standing my ground, by refusing to be silenced or erased. The fire I had lit in the backyard was a turning point, a declaration that my memories and my life were mine to shape and protect. Throughout this ordeal, I learned that resilience is not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it is quiet and steadfast, a refusal to be broken by those who seek to diminish you. It is found in the small decisions to hold on to what matters, to speak when words are scarce, and to walk forward even when the path is uncertain. My son's attempts to control and diminish me were painful, but they also revealed a deeper truth, that I was stronger than I had believed, that my past, my memories, and my identity could not be taken from me unless I allowed it. This period of second escalation tested my resolve in ways I had never imagined. The legal threats, the social pressures, the emotional battles wore on me. But I faced them with a quiet determination born from years of surviving loss and loneliness. I knew that the road ahead would be difficult and that the fight for dignity and respect was ongoing. Yet, I also knew that I was not alone, and that the connections I had rekindled with friends and my grandson offered hope and strength. As the days turned into weeks, I began to envision a future where I could live on my own terms, where my memories were respected and my voice heard. The second escalation was not the end, but a crucible that refined my will and clarified what I was willing to fight for. I had set fire to the photographs, yes, but I had also ignited a fire within myself, a fire that would burn bright and steady, a light to guide me through whatever came next. The moment of culmination did not come as a sudden storm, but as a quiet, resolute act that echoed louder than any shout could have, a turning point that marked the boundary between what I had endured and what I was finally willing to accept. For years, I had lived in the shadows of other people's decisions, their plans for my life drawn without my consent, and their judgments weighing heavier than any grief I had carried alone. The burning of the letters and the photographs had been my way of reclaiming some small piece of myself. But the true climax came when I decided to sever the final ties that bound me to a family who had never truly seen me. It was a legal declaration, a carefully written letter sent to my son's lawyer, one that spoke not with anger or bitterness, but with the cold clarity of a woman who had found her voice at last. I informed them that I was of sound mind, living independently and without duress, and that any further attempts to control or contact me under the guise of concern would be considered harassment. That letter was the final line I drew in the sand, a declaration of my autonomy that could not be ignored or erased. Writing that letter was both terrifying and liberating. I knew it would change everything, that it would close doors and sever connections, but I also knew that it was necessary. For too long, I had lived as a shadow in my own home, a ghost in the lives of those I had raised and loved. The letter was not a surrender, but a reclaiming, a way of saying that I was no longer willing to be a character in someone else's story. I sent it with steady hands, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and resolve, and in that moment, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The act was irreversible, a point of no return, but it was also the first true step toward freedom. In the days that followed, the silence was heavy but somehow comforting. The phone no longer rang with demands or veiled threats. The visits stopped, replaced by an emptiness that was both painful and necessary. I found myself alone, truly alone, but it was a solitude I had chosen rather than one imposed upon me. I could fill the space with my own breath, my own memories, and my own quiet plans for the future. It was in this space that I began to truly rebuild, not from the rubble of loss, but from the foundation of my own strength and dignity. One afternoon, as I sat by the window of my small apartment watching the light shift and soften, I received a visit from my grandson, Kieran. Unlike the others, he came without judgment or expectation, carrying only the quiet presence of someone who simply wanted to be near. We spoke without pressure or demands, sharing stories and silences, rebuilding a connection that had not been broken, but had lain dormant. His presence was a balm to the wounds left by years of conflict, a reminder that not all ties were severed beyond repair. With him, I found a gentle acceptance and a hope that had seemed lost. The world outside continued to press in with its challenges and uncertainties, but inside, I was reclaiming a peace I had not known in years. I took pleasure in the small rituals of daily life, the taste of warm tea, the feel of a well-worn book in my hands, the quiet companionship of a neighbor's smile. The memories I had fought to preserve became not chains, but wings, allowing me to soar above the pain and reclaim the woman I had been before loss tried to define me. I began to volunteer more regularly at the thrift shop beneath my apartment, finding joy in helping others and in the connections that grew from shared stories and small kindnesses. The house of my past, the home once filled with photographs and letters, was now a distant place, one I no longer sought to reclaim physically, but held tenderly in my heart. The final act of sending that letter to my son's lawyer had severed the last tie that bound me to a life that had not valued me, but it had also opened the door to a new existence, one defined not by what I had lost, but by what I was still capable of. Creating. The fire that had consumed the photographs and letters had not destroyed me. It had purified me, leaving behind only what was essential and true. In the quiet moments of reflection, I often thought about the years of silence and submission that had preceded this climax, the long shadows of grief and neglect that had threatened to consume me. But I also thought about the strength that had carried me through, the determination to remember, to write, to resist. The woman I had become was not one defined by victimhood, but by resilience and choice. I was no longer waiting for forgiveness or recognition. I was living on my own terms, with a dignity that no one could take away. That dignity was not loud or showy, but a steady flame burning quietly within me, a light that guided me through the darkest nights and the loneliest days. It was the knowledge that I had the power to say no, to walk away, and to build a life that honored my memories without being chained to them. The climax of my story was not a dramatic confrontation, but a peaceful, powerful assertion of self. A letter written not with bitterness, but with the calm certainty of a woman who had finally found her voice. As I folded that letter and sealed it in the envelope, I felt a profound sense of closure. It was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. A story of survival and renewal, written not in fire and ashes, but in quiet strength and hope. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, I knew that I would walk it with my head held high, carrying with me the lessons of the past and the promise of a future shaped by my own hand. The days following my final act of defiance were quieter than I expected, filled not with confrontation, but with a slow unfolding of a life I had almost forgotten was possible. In the absence of the voices that once dictated my worth and shaped my existence, I found space to breathe, to reflect, and to begin the gentle work of healing. The silence was not empty, but full of the echoes of memories I had chosen to keep, the soft presence of a past that no longer bound me but instead offered a foundation upon which I could stand. I found myself sitting by the window more often, watching the play of light across the streets below, feeling a deep connection to the world around me and to the woman I was becoming. One of the greatest gifts of this new chapter was the renewed relationship with my grandson, Kieran. Unlike the fraught exchanges with my son, our conversations were unburdened by expectation or judgment. He came to visit often, bringing with him a warmth and openness that reminded me of the love I had once known in its purest form. We talked about books and music, shared stories of our days, and sometimes sat in comfortable silence, simply enjoying each other's presence. His gentle encouragement and genuine care were a balm to the wounds left by years of conflict, a reminder that family could be a source of strength rather than pain. Through him, I found hope that the ties of blood could be woven anew with understanding and respect. In the quiet rhythms of daily life, I discovered pleasures that had long been overshadowed by grief and loss. The simple act of preparing a meal, the feel of warm sunlight on my skin during morning walks, the sound of laughter shared with new friends at the thrift shop where I volunteered, all these moments became threads in the tapestry of a life reclaimed. I began to write more frequently, not just memories, but reflections on resilience, on the power of choice, and on the quiet courage it takes to say no and walk away. Writing became not only a refuge, but a way to connect with others who might be carrying their own invisible burdens. The apartment that had once felt like a prison transformed into a sanctuary. I filled it with the things that brought me joy: a vase of fresh flowers on the windowsill, photographs that held happy memories, books that invited me to explore new worlds. The garden outside flourished under my care, a symbol of renewal and growth that mirrored the changes within me. Each day, I nurtured not only the plants, but the seeds of hope and strength that had taken root in my heart. The fire that had once consumed so much of my past had cleared the way for new life to emerge, fragile yet persistent. Though the past still visited me in quiet moments, the ache of loss, the sting of betrayal, I learned to hold it with compassion rather than pain. I forgave not because those who had hurt me deserved it, but because I needed to free myself from the chains of resentment. Forgiveness became a gift I gave to myself, a way to release the bitterness that threatened to consume my joy. I was no longer a prisoner of what had been done to me, but a woman who chose to live fully, to love freely, and to embrace the uncertain beauty of each new day. As the seasons changed, so too did my understanding of family and belonging. I realized that home was not merely a place or a collection of memories, but a state of being, a sense of peace and acceptance that I could carry with me wherever I went. The family I had known, with all its fractures and disappointments, was only one part of my story. I found new family in friends who saw me, in neighbors who offered kindness, and in the community that welcomed me without condition. These connections, built on respect and mutual care, nourished my spirit and reminded me that I was never truly alone. In quiet moments, I often reflected on the journey that had brought me here. The fires burned, the letters lost, the battles fought and won. I thought of the woman I had been, the woman I had become, and the woman I was still becoming. Each step forward was a testament to resilience, a declaration that life, even when scarred by loss, held the possibility of renewal and joy. I kept a small card on the inside of my dresser drawer, a letter to myself I had written one night. You waited so long for someone to save you. You forgot you were always the one holding the key. You didn't lose them. They let go. And you finally let go back. And look at the life that opened. Well done. Those words were a quiet anthem, a reminder that the greatest power lies in choosing yourself. This is my story now. A story not of surrender, but of survival, not of loss, but of liberation. I share it with the hope that it might reach someone who feels unseen, unheard, or forgotten. To you, I say this: your worth is not defined by others' acceptance or rejection. You hold the power to reclaim your life, to write your own story, and to live with dignity and grace. It is never too late to choose yourself, to walk away from what diminishes you, and to build something new from the ashes of the past. When you do, come back and tell me. I will be here, listening, ready to welcome you into the quiet strength of a life truly lived.